On a quiet Sunday in February 2024, the manicured silence of the British aristocracy was shattered by a single gunshot in the Cotswolds. The tragedy did not strike the king, nor the heir, but the family of the most controversial woman to ever walk the halls of Kensington Palace, Princess Michael of Kent. For 50 years, she was known simply as Princess Pushy, the villain of the Windsor soap opera who wore racist jewelry to meet Meghan Markle and allegedly told diners to go back to the colonies. She spent a lifetime building a fortress of arrogance, convinced that titles and tiaras were the ultimate protection against the chaos of the real world. But when her golden son-in-law was found dead by his own hand, that fortress collapsed from the inside. This is not merely the story of a royal snob. It is the autopsy of a Greek tragedy, revealing how a woman who spent decades fighting to be the most important person in the room ended up standing alone in the wreckage of a grief she could not spin, could not control, and could not survive. We are accustomed to the tragedies of the victim, like Princess Diana, or the tragedies of the exile, like the Duke of Windsor. But Marie Christine represents the tragedy of the imposter. This is not to say she is a fraud in the legal sense. Her lineage is ancient, stretching back to the courts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, but rather that her entire life has been a frantic, exhausting performance of a status she possesses on paper but has never truly possessed in reality. She is a woman who has spent 50 years trying to prove she belongs in a room where everyone else is sitting comfortably, while she remains the only one standing, terrified that if she sits down, the chair will be pulled away. Her story is an operatic saga of hubris, breathtaking insecurity, racism scandals that reveal the dark underbelly of the aristocracy, and a relentless financial desperation that is now in the twilight of her life, culminated in a heartbreak so profound it has shattered the porcelain mask she spent a lifetime painting. To find the source of the anxiety that drives the Princess Pushy persona, one cannot start in the drawing rooms of London. One must travel back to the smoldering ruins of Central Europe in 1945. Marie Christine was not born into the stable, tea-drinking continuity of the Windsors. She was born in Carlsbad, in the Sudetenland, mere months before the collapse of the Third Reich. The timing of her birth is the first clue to her psychology. She arrived in a world that was ending. Her father, Baron Gunther von Reibnitz, was a Silesian nobleman, a figure of old-world authority and glamour. But he was also something else, a secret that would hang over Marie Christine's head like a guillotine blade for decades. He served as an officer in the SS Cavalry Corps, and some records list him as holding the rank of major. This is the primal wound. While Queen Elizabeth II was a young woman driving ambulances for the Allied war effort, Marie Christine's father was an officer in the organization responsible for the darkest crimes in human history. Although later investigations would suggest he was a member of the Cavalry SS and not the Camp Guards, and that he had been dismissed from the party for marrying a Catholic, the stain was indelible. Marie Christine was born into displacement. As the Red Army advanced from the east, the Reibnitz family, like thousands of other German aristocrats, fled. They lost everything. The castles, the estates, the hunting lodges, the entire infrastructure of their nobility was vaporized overnight. The Baroness did not grow up walking the grounds of an ancestral home. She grew up in the dust and heat of suburban Australia. Following her parents' divorce, a young Marie Christine was taken by her mother to Sydney. The contrast could not have been more violent. She went from being a scion of European nobility to being the daughter of a hairdresser in a working-class neighborhood. This period of her life, often glossed over in her own retellings, is the crucible that forged her character. Imagine the cognitive dissonance of a young girl who is told at the dinner table that she is a baroness, descended from kings and queens, but who has to go to school in a rough-and-tumble Australian suburb where no one cares about heraldry and where her mother is scrubbing other women's scalps to pay the rent. It bred a ferocious hunger in her. She felt like a queen in exile, a diamond wrapped in newspaper. It instilled in her a lifelong terror of being ordinary. To be ordinary was to be poor, to be forgotten, to be a hairdresser's daughter in Sydney. To be royal was to be safe. When she returned to Europe in her late teens, she was not just looking for a career or a husband. She was looking for a restoration. She arrived in London in the swinging 60s, a city that was shedding its post-war gloom and exploding with music, fashion, and social mobility. But Marie-Christine was not interested in the Beatles or the miniskirt revolution. She was interested in the old world. She stood out immediately. She was 6 feet tall, strikingly beautiful, and possessed a booming, authoritative voice that sounded more German than English. She quickly set about inserting herself into the highest echelons of society with a determination that was almost military in its precision. She worked as an interior designer, a job that allowed her access to the homes of the wealthy, where she could observe, learn, and replicate the codes of the upper class. She was a quick study. She learned that in England, class is not just about money, it is about confidence. If you act as though you own the building, the doorman will usually open the door. Her first attempt at securing her fortress came in the form of Thomas Trowbridge, a banker from a prestigious British family. They married in 1971. It was a good match, a sensible match. It gave her a British passport and a foothold in society. But for Marie-Christine, sensible was not enough. She had a grander vision of herself. The marriage to Trowbridge deteriorated as her ambition outgrew his ledger. She was restless. She wanted a stage, and a banker's wife, no matter how wealthy, is essentially a member of the audience. She wanted to be on the stage. It was during this period of marital dissatisfaction that she crossed paths with Prince Michael of Kent. Prince Michael was the Queen's first cousin, the younger son of the dashing Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. In the genetic lottery of the royal family, Michael was the quiet one. He was not the heir. His older brother Edward was the Duke of Kent. He was not the star, but he had the blood. He was a grandson of King George V and Queen Mary. He was a Tsar of Russia look-alike, with a perfectly trimmed beard and a silent, melancholic demeanor that Marie-Christine found irresistible. He was the vessel into which she could pour all her ambition. But there were obstacles, massive constitutional obstacles, that would have stopped a less determined woman in her tracks. First, she was still married to Thomas Trowbridge. In the eyes of the Church of England and the royal family of the 1970s, divorce was still a dirty word. It was a mark of failure and moral laxity. Second, and perhaps more explosively, she was a Roman Catholic. The Act of Settlement of 1701, a piece of legislation born of ancient sectarian paranoia, specifically forbade anyone in the line of succession to the British throne from marrying a Catholic. If Prince Michael married her, he would automatically lose his place in the line of succession. He would be stripping himself of his constitutional rights for love. For Marie-Christine, this dramatic hurdle only added to the romance. It elevated the relationship from a mere affair to a Wagnerian epic. She wasn't just dating a prince, she was the heroine of a forbidden tragedy. She pursued the annulment of her first marriage with a ferocity that stunned her lawyers, eventually securing it from the Pope himself, a rare and difficult feat. Then came the negotiation with the crown, Prince Michael, a man of duty and quiet reserve, was utterly captivated by this whirlwind of a woman. She was everything he was not: loud, confident, bursting with energy and opinions. She sucked the oxygen out of the room, and he seemed happy to let her breathe for both of them. He agreed to forfeit his rights to the throne. The wedding took place in Vienna in 1978. It was not the fairy tale carriage ride through London that Lady Diana Spencer would enjoy 3 years later. It was a civil ceremony followed by a ball. The Queen did not attend. Prince Charles did not attend. The absence of the senior royals was a polite but icy signal from the establishment. We tolerate this, but we do not celebrate it. This snub is essential to understanding the chip on Princess Michael's shoulder. She entered the family feeling already marginalized, already judged. She felt that because she was foreign, because she was Catholic, and because she was new, she was being looked down upon by people she considered her intellectual inferiors. It was this insecurity that birthed Princess Pushy. Upon her return to London as Her Royal Highness Princess Michael of Kent, she did not adopt the strategy of quiet assimilation, which was the path chosen by the Duchess of Gloucester. Instead, Marie Christine decided to out-royal the royals. If they thought she was too grand, she would be grander. If they thought she was arrogant, she would be imperial. She insisted on being addressed properly at all times. She adopted a style of dress that was more Versailles than Windsor: furs, capes, massive jewels. She spoke about her own lineage constantly, reminding anyone who would listen that she was descended from Charlemagne and Madame de Pompadour. It was a defense mechanism, a way of saying, I may not have your money and I may not have your crown, but my blood is older than yours. But the grand performance hit a very mundane reality wall: money. Prince Michael was a second son. He received no parliamentary annuity. He was not paid by the state to be a prince. Yet the couple moved into apartment 10 at Kensington Palace, a royal residence that came with the status, but also with the expectation of a lifestyle they could not afford. This is where the grift began. This is where the seeds of the future scandals were sown. They were living in a palace on a pauper's budget. Relatively speaking, they had the address, but they didn't have the income to support the staff, the clothes, and the entertaining that Marie Christine felt was necessary to maintain her dignity. So she went to work. But she didn't get a job in a bank. She monetized her title. She began writing books, histories of royal women, queens, and mistresses. It was a clever move, allowing her to trade on her fascination with royalty while earning a paycheck. But along with the books came the favors. The Kents became known in London society as the couple who would attend the opening of an envelope if there was a free dinner involved. They accepted hospitality from wealthy Americans, Arab sheikhs, and questionable business tycoons. They were the royal guests for hire, lending their luster to anyone willing to foot the bill for a private jet or a yacht holiday. This behavior horrified the Queen's courtiers. It was seen as vulgar, a dilution of the royal brand. But Marie Christine didn't care. She had bills to pay, and she was determined to live like a queen, even if she had to hustle like a commoner to do it. By the mid-1980s, the Princess Pushy nickname had stuck. It was allegedly coined by Princess Anne, a woman who had zero patience for pretension. The press latched onto it with glee. Marie Christine became the designated villain of the royal soap opera. While Diana was the saint and Fergie was the fun one, Marie Christine was the snob. Stories began to leak out of the palace staff quarters. They whispered of a woman who would snap her fingers at servants, who would throw tantrums if the car wasn't ready, who treated the staff at Kensington Palace as her personal serfs. But the most damaging revelation of this era was the resurrection of her father's ghost. In 1985, the Daily Mirror published the proof of Baron von Reibnitz's SS membership. The headline was devastating. For a member of the British royal family, the family that had stood on the balcony while London burned during the Blitz, to be the daughter of an SS officer was a PR nightmare. Marie-Christine went on television to defend herself. In a famous interview, she wept. She claimed she hadn't known the extent of his involvement. She played the victim. "My shoulders are broad," she said. "I shall have to carry it." It was a moment of rare vulnerability, but even then, the public sympathy was limited. There was a sense that the karma of her arrogance was finally catching up with her. She had spent years boasting about her ancestry. Now, that ancestry was biting back. Yet she survived. She survived because, in the 1980s and 90s, the royal family had bigger problems. The War of the Waleses, Charles and Diana, was consuming all the oxygen. The Kents were a sideshow. They were allowed to continue their precarious existence in Kensington Palace, paying their peppercorn rent, turning up for Christmas lunch, and existing in a strange, gray zone of royalty. They were in, but not of, the inner circle. And it was in this gray zone that Marie-Christine's bitterness began to calcify into something toxic. As Diana and Sarah Ferguson became global celebrities, dominating headlines and public affection, the Kents were pushed further into the background. The public story of the monarchy now revolved around the Wales women, not the old world continental aristocrats like Princess Michael. This resentment festered. It became the background radiation of her life. She began to make comments that raised eyebrows at dinner parties. She would critique the awful decor of Windsor Castle. She would make snide remarks about the Queen's corgis. She became the difficult aunt, the one you invited out of obligation, but seated at the far end of the table. But as the new millennium approached and the world became more sensitive, more aware of privilege and prejudice, Marie-Christine did not evolve. She stayed frozen in the amber of her own self-importance. She did not realize that the protective shield of the monarchy was thinning, and that the deference she demanded was no longer automatic. She was walking toward a cliff edge, blinded by her own reflection in the mirror, unaware that the ground beneath her feet and the tolerance of the British public was about to give way entirely. But arrogance, no matter how carefully cultivated, acts only as a shield against social judgment. It offers no protection against the cold, hard mathematics of survival. As the 20th century wound down, the deference that had allowed the Kents to exist in their nebulous aristocratic bubble was evaporating. The new millennium would bring with it a ruthless forensic accounting, stripping away the velvet curtains to reveal the rotting beams underneath, and proving that the ground beneath Princess Michael's feet was far more fragile than she had ever dared to imagine. By the turn of the millennium, the protective membrane that had long shielded the minor royals from the harsh economic realities of civilian life had begun to disintegrate. For decades, the British public had maintained a respectful, if slightly grumbling silence regarding the peripheral members of the Windsor clan, the cousins and aunts, who appeared on the balcony but did little actual work for the nation. But as the internet age dawned and the scrutiny on the royal finances intensified, that silence broke. And standing squarely in the crosshairs of this new era of transparency was Princess Michael of Kent. If the 1980s were defined by her social climbing, the early 2000s were defined by a humiliating public audit of her lifestyle. The scandal that erupted in 2002 was not about lineage or etiquette. It was about real estate. It was revealed that Prince and Princess Michael had been living in apartment 10 at Kensington Palace, a prime central London residence with 5 reception rooms and 7 bedrooms, a property that would command a market rent of over £120,000 a year for a mere £69 per week. To put this in perspective, £69 was less than what a student would pay for a single room in a drafty shared house in the suburbs. The Kents were paying a peppercorn rent for a palace, ostensibly in recognition of the charitable work they performed. The problem, however, was that the Kents were not working royals. Unlike Princess Anne or Prince Edward, they did not carry out official engagements on behalf of the Queen funded by the civil list. They were private citizens with HRH titles. The revelation that the taxpayer was essentially subsidizing the housing of a couple known for their extravagant taste, their furs, and their holidays triggered a wave of populist fury. It was the ultimate symbol of the freeloader narrative that Princess Michael had spent years trying to avoid. She was cast not just as Princess Pushy, but as Princess Freeloader. The Queen, ever the pragmatist and desperate to avoid a parliamentary inquiry that could damage the monarchy's standing, stepped in. In a move that was both generous and deeply humiliating for the Kents, Her Majesty agreed to pay the market rent for the apartment out of her own private income for a period of 7 years. It was a stay of execution, a financial bailout from the head of the family to the poor relations. For Marie Christine, a woman whose entire self-worth was constructed around the idea of her own grandeur, this was a bitter pill. She was being treated like a charity case by the very woman she had often privately criticized for being boring. She went on the offensive, giving interviews in which she complained about the downsizing they would have to endure, famously stating, "I am in very deep trouble." But the public sympathy was non-existent. When she lamented that they might have to move to a smaller house, the collective response of the British working class was a shrug of indifference. This financial precarity fueled a new phase in Princess Michael's career, the era of the rent-a-Kent. Desperate to generate the income required to maintain her lifestyle, once the Queen's subsidy ran out, she accelerated her commercial activities. She became the president of a gallery, she consulted for luxury brands, and she continued to churn out historical novels. There is a tragedy in this hustle. Here was a woman who believed she was born to rule, forced to act as a glorified salesperson for her own brand. She was selling the mystique of royalty to pay the electric bill. Every gala dinner she attended, every ribbon she cut for a fee, chipped away at the very exclusivity she prized. She was commercializing the crown, turning the sanctity of the royal title into a commodity. It was during this period of high stress and financial maneuvering that the darker, sharper edges of her personality began to cut through the veneer of social niceties. The bitterness she felt toward the senior royals, who had the money, the security, and the status she craved, began to spill over into her interactions with the world. She had always been known for her sharp tongue, but now the remarks became laced with a venom that suggested a deep internal unhappiness. She famously described the older royals as boring for their obsession with horses and dogs. She dismissed Princess Diana even years after her death as nasty and bitter, a comment that displayed a stunning lack of emotional intelligence given Diana's sainthood in the public imagination. Marie Christine seemed unable to read the room. She was broadcasting on a frequency that had been canceled years ago, but these were merely social skirmishes, the kind of catty remarks that could be laughed off as the eccentricities of a jealous aunt. The incident that would permanently alter her reputation and shift the narrative from snobbery to racism occurred far away from the protective walls of Kensington Palace. It happened in the noisy democratic chaos of New York City. The date was May 2004. The venue was Da Silvano, a trendy, celebrity-heavy Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village. Princess Michael was dining with a group of friends, holding court in her usual manner. At a nearby table sat a group of successful African American media executives and bankers enjoying a lively dinner. The noise level in the restaurant was high. It was New York, after all. But for Princess Michael, accustomed to the hushed deference of European dining rooms, the laughter and conversation from the neighboring table was an affront. According to eyewitnesses, the princess became increasingly agitated. She slammed her hand on the table. Then, in a moment that would be dissected by the media for years to come, she allegedly turned to the group of African Americans and shouted, "You need to quiet down. You need to go back to the colonies." The room went silent. The phrase "go back to the colonies" is not a generic insult. It is a specific loaded weapon of colonial supremacy. It implies that black people do not belong in the spaces of the elite, that their presence is tolerated only as subjects, not as equals. It stripped away the mask of the cosmopolitan European intellectual Marie-Christine tried to wear, and revealed the mindset of a colonial administrator from the 19th century. The backlash was immediate. The diners confronted her. One of them, A.J. Benza, a gossip columnist who happened to be there, reported the incident to the world. The New York Post ran the headline, "Royal Bigot." Back in London, the palace press office went into meltdown. Princess Michael issued a denial, but it was a denial that only deepened the hole. She claimed she had not said, "Go back to the colonies," but rather, "You should remember the colonies," implying that during colonial times, people had better manners. It was a defense that relied on the nostalgia for the British Empire, a defense that was almost as offensive as the alleged slur itself. In a disastrous attempt to clear her name, she agreed to a television interview on ITV. What followed was one of the most excruciating hours of television in royal history. Trying to prove her lack of prejudice, she uttered the now infamous line, "I even pretended years ago to be an African, a half-caste African, but because of my light eyes I did not get away with it, but I dyed my hair black." She went on to say, "I traveled on African buses. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted experiences from Cape Town to write up in northern Mozambique. I had this adventure with these absolutely adorable, special people, and to call me racist, it's a knife through the heart because I really love these people. These people." The phrase hung in the air, patronizing, othering, and deeply revealing. She spoke of Africans not as equals, but as adorable subjects of her anthropological curiosity. She sounded like a tourist visiting a human zoo. Instead of extinguishing the fire, she had poured gasoline on it. She had proven that her racism was not necessarily the burning cross variety of the KKK, but the paternalistic, condescending racism of the old European aristocracy. The belief that she was the benevolent superior, and they were the colorful, rhythmic backdrop to her grand life. The colonies scandal of 2004 was a turning point. Before this, Princess Michael was a figure of fun. After this, she was a figure of toxicity. She became radioactive. The Queen, who had spent decades overseeing the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth, a multiracial association of equals, was reportedly furious. The Kents were pushed further to the margins. They were no longer just the poor relations. They were the embarrassing relations. Yet remarkably, Marie-Christine did not retreat. A person with more self-awareness might have withdrawn from public life, sensing that the zeitgeist had turned against them. But Marie-Christine possesses a hide of rhinoceros thickness. She viewed the criticism not as a valid moral judgment, but as the impertinence of the unwashed masses. In her mind, she was the victim. She was the intellectual, the historian, the woman of breeding who was being misunderstood by a coarse, politically correct world. She doubled down on her hauteur. She continued to attend the galas, chin held high. eyes scanning the room for anyone who dared to look at her with anything less than total adoration. However, the universe has a way of escalating its lessons until they are learned. The colony's scandal was a verbal warning. The next major controversy would be visual, and it would strike at the very heart of the modern monarchy's identity crisis. As the years rolled on toward the 2000s, the royal family began to change. William and Harry were growing up. The firm was modernizing. And then Prince Harry met Meghan Markle. The arrival of Meghan Markle, a biracial American divorced actress, was the ultimate stress test for the Windsor establishment. It was everything Marie-Christine had likely spent her life looking down upon. Here was a woman who was new money, show business, and crucially, not white. For the progressive wing of the public, Meghan was a breath of fresh air. For the old guard, represented most vocally by Princess Michael, she was an intrusion. The stage was set for the Christmas lunch of 2017. This was the annual gathering at Buckingham Palace where the extended family, the Gloucesters, the Kents, the minor cousins, would meet the new addition. It was Meghan's first introduction to the wider clan. It was a moment that called for maximum diplomacy and welcome. Princess Michael, deciding on her outfit for the day, reached into her jewelry box. She had thousands of items to choose from: diamonds, pearls, gold, sapphires. She chose a brooch. It was a piece of blackamoor jewelry. Blackamoor is a style of decorative art from the 17th and 18th centuries that depicts African men and women usually in turbans and jewels, often in positions of servitude or exoticized submission. To art historians, they are artifacts of a specific era. To a modern, racially conscious world, they are symbols of the fetishization of slavery. To wear such a brooch to a lunch where you are meeting the first mixed-race member of the royal family was an act of breathtaking aggression. Was it accidental? Her defenders claimed it was. They said she had owned the brooch for decades, that she simply liked the colors, that she didn't think about the symbolism. But Marie-Christine is not a stupid woman. She is a historian. She has written books about the courts of Europe. She understands semiotics. She understands the language of symbols. Whether or not it was intentional, wearing a blackamoor brooch to meet Meghan sent a message that millions found impossible to see as accidental. The paparazzi photos of her arriving at the palace gates, the blackamoor brooch pinned proudly to her coat, went viral within minutes. The internet exploded. The Princess Pushy nickname was retired. Now, she was openly called a racist. The apology that followed was standard boilerplate. Princess Michael is very sorry and distressed that it has caused offense. But it felt hollow. Once again, she had proven that she was incapable of seeing the world through any lens other than her own outdated, aristocratic monocle. But while the public raged, a quieter, more corrosive reality was eating away at the Kent family from the inside. The scandals were loud, but the silence of their irrelevance was deafening. Princess Michael was becoming a relic. The world was moving on. The cameras were focused on William and Kate, on Harry and Meghan. The Kents were becoming background extras in the royal movie. And as old age began to creep in, bringing with it the frailty of the body, Marie-Christine began to look less like the Wagnerian heroine she imagined herself to be, and more like a ghost haunting a museum that was closing for the night. Her health began to falter. In the early 2020s, she was struck down by COVID-19. Reports surfaced that she was suffering from blood clots and extreme fatigue. The invincible Baroness was mortal, after all. She retreated to the countryside, to her garden, perhaps hoping that the twilight of her life would be peaceful. She had her daughter, Lady Gabriella, who was the shining light of her life, a beautiful, well-adjusted woman who had married Thomas Kingston, a handsome financier, in a wedding that looked for a brief moment like a happy ending. It seemed that perhaps the drama was over. It seemed that the Fates had finally lost interest in the House of Kent. But the Fates were not done. They were simply waiting for the most devastating act of all. The racism scandals, the rent controversies, the snobbery, all of that was merely the prologue to a pain that no amount of arrogance could deflect. The castle walls can keep out the paparazzi, and they can keep out the public, but they cannot keep out the darkness of the human mind. And that darkness was coming for her family, specifically for the son-in-law she adored, carrying with it a tragedy that would make the previous 40 years of social climbing look utterly, heartbreakingly trivial. However, the House of Windsor has always operated on a pendulum swing between scandal and sanctuary, and history rarely moves in a straight line toward oblivion. Just as it seemed that Marie Christine's legacy would be defined entirely by these toxic blunders and her physical decline, the narrative arc offered her one final, shimmering illusion of redemption. It would not come from her own rehabilitation, but from the flawless performance of the one person she had managed to raise untainted amidst the chaos, offering the Kents a brief, deceptive golden hour before the sun finally set. In the grand, sweeping narrative of the British monarchy, there is a recurring rhythm. Crisis is almost always followed by a period of forced stabilization, a closing of ranks where the institution smooths over the cracks with pageantry and tradition. For Princess Michael of Kent, the years following the disastrous racism scandals of 2017 were meant to be this period of quiet rehabilitation. The Blackamoor incident had been a public relations nuclear winter, scorching her reputation and isolating her further from the warm, progressive glow of the younger royals. But the monarchy plays the long game. Scandals fade, headlines are replaced, and if one lives long enough, notoriety often softens into a form of benign eccentricity. As Marie Christine entered her late 70s, a subtle shift began to occur. The Princess Pushy of the tabloid imagination, the woman who terrorized restaurants and insulted the colonies, began to be replaced by a frailer, quieter figure, the matriarch in Windsor. The instrument of this redemption was not Marie Christine herself. She was far too polarizing to rehabilitate her own image, but her daughter, Lady Gabriella Windsor. In the complex genetic lottery of the House of Windsor, Lady Gabriella, known affectionately as Ella, had drawn the winning ticket. She possessed her mother's height and striking blonde beauty, but none of her mother's abrasive edges. She was intelligent, Oxford-educated, and crucially, she was discreet. While her brother, Lord Frederick Windsor, had enjoyed a somewhat colorful youth involving society parties and headlines, Gabriella had glided through life with the grace of a swan, avoiding the scandals that seemed to cling to her parents like static electricity. She was the one undeniable success of the Kent household, the proof that despite the financial chaos and the social climbing, Marie Christine had raised a decent, grounded human being. In May 2019, the eyes of the world turned once again to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It was the same venue where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had married a year earlier in a frenzy of global hysteria. But Lady Gabriella's wedding was a different affair entirely. It was the apotheosis of the old guard style, elegant, aristocratic, and steeped in a quiet, confident tradition. For Princess Michael, this day was her masterpiece. It was the moment she had been rehearsing for since she first stepped off the plane from Australia 50 years prior. Dressed in a stunning ensemble of lilac and cream, she looked every inch the regal mother of the bride. But what made the day truly significant was the guest list. The Queen was there. Prince Philip, frail and retired from public duties, made a rare appearance. Prince Harry was there. The presence of the monarch was the ultimate signal. It was a gesture of dynastic forgiveness. It said to the world, the Kents may be difficult, they may be embarrassing, but they are family. For Marie Christine, watching her daughter walk down the aisle to marry Thomas Kingston, it must have felt like a vindication. The struggles, the rent scandals, the bad press, it all dissolved in the face of this perfect, glittering tableau. She had secured the succession. She had launched her daughter into a safe harbor. And what a harbor it was. Thomas Kingston was, on paper and in person, the platonic ideal of a royal spouse. Handsome, with the chiseled jawline of a 1940s film star, he was not just a pretty face. He was a man of substance, a financier with a history in diplomatic relations. He had worked in Baghdad for the International Center for Reconciliation, negotiating the release of hostages and navigating the treacherous waters of post-war Iraq. He was brave, he was charming, and he was impeccably connected. He had previously dated Pippa Middleton, the future Queen's sister. To Marie Christine, Thomas Kingston was a dream realized. He validated her worldview. He was a man of the establishment, a man who understood the codes of high society. Yet he possessed a modern capability that the older generation of royals often lacked. He wasn't a spare looking for a purpose. He was a man who had made his own way. The years following the wedding, from 2019 to 2023, felt like an Indian summer for the Kents. The storm clouds seemed to have parted. Photographs from this era show a family that looks, for the first time in decades, genuinely at ease. We see Princess Michael attending Wimbledon, not with the frantic, wide-eyed stare of a woman fighting for her seat, but with the relaxed smile of a grandmother. We see her at Ascot, leaning on the arm of her new son-in-law, looking up at him with evident adoration. Thomas Kingston had become a stabilizing force in the chaotic energy of the Kent household. He was the ballast. He was the bridge between the erratic old-world glamour of Marie Christine and the modern, sensible reality of the 21st century. However, beneath the surface of this newfound peace, biology was beginning to extract its toll. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept through the world, and it did not spare Kensington Palace. Princess Michael contracted the virus early, and she contracted it severely. For weeks, she was laid low, battling high fevers, and subsequently dangerous blood clots. The physical transformation was startling. The Wan, who had always been a statue of Teutonic strength, who had loomed over her husband and her critics, suddenly looked diminished. She appeared thinner, her movements more tentative. The Valkyrie was proving to be mortal. This physical decline forced a psychological shift. For the first time, Marie Christine had to rely on others. She had to be cared for. This vulnerability likely drew her closer to her children, particularly Gabriella and Thomas. The dependency of the aging parent often softens the jagged edges of their personality, and reports from the palace suggested a mellower Princess Michael. She was spending more time at her country home in Gloucestershire, surrounded by her books and her history, leaving the sharp-elbowed jostling of London society to the younger generation. It felt like the natural, quiet ending to a loud life. The script seemed written. The controversial princess would slowly fade into the background, protected by her wealthy son-in-law and her devoted daughter, living out her days as a harmless, slightly eccentric relic of a bygone era. But the universe is rarely so neat, and the human mind is a labyrinth that even the highest walls of a palace cannot secure. From the outside, the marriage looked stable and affectionate. Friends and family later told the coroner they had seen no obvious warning signs that Thomas was close to a crisis. We often assume that those who live in the orbit of royalty are insulated from the despair of the common man. We assume that money, status, and beauty act as a vaccine against the abyss. But depression is a Democrat. It does not check the guest list before it enters the room. Thomas Kingston was a man who had seen the darkest corners of the world in Iraq. He had stared into the face of violence and negotiation. As a successful financier and royal son-in-law, he inevitably lived under heavy expectations. Even if he never spoke publicly about any strain, one must always be on. One must always be charming. The stiff upper lip is not just a cliche, it is a survival mechanism, and sometimes it is a prison. The timeline of late 2023 and early 2024 is now viewed through the retrospective lens of tragedy. Looking back, we search for clues. Were there cracks in the mask? Was the smile in the Christmas photos a little too fixed? Was there a quiet desperation in the eyes? The truth is, we will likely never know. The defining characteristic of the perfect courtier is the ability to hide pain. Thomas Kingston was a master of the code. He did not act out. He did not create scandals. He kept his suffering, whatever it was, locked in a vault, hidden from the paparazzi who snapped his picture, and perhaps even from the family who adored him. Then came the date that will be etched into the history of the Kent family forever. February 25th, 2024. It was a Sunday. The location was the Kingston family home in the Cotswolds, a place of stone walls and rolling hills, a landscape of quintessential English peace. Thomas had visited his parents for lunch. It was a routine domestic scene. He had not seemed agitated. He had not left a note on the table. He simply told his father he was going to lock up the outbuilding. Minutes turned into an hour. The silence of the countryside, usually so soothing, began to curdle into something ominous. His father went to look for him. He found him in the outbuilding. But Thomas was not locking up. The scene that greeted his father was the stuff of nightmares, a moment of violence that shattered the pastoral quiet. A gun was found at the scene. The police were called. Paramedics arrived, but there was nothing to be done. Thomas Kingston, the golden boy, the survivor of Baghdad, the man who had seemingly won the game of life, was dead at the age of 45. The cause of death was confirmed at the inquest. A traumatic wound to the head. Suicide. The news hit Kensington Palace not as a ripple, but as a tsunami. For Princess Michael, the news must have been incomprehensible. She belongs to a generation and a class that views suicide as the ultimate taboo, a failure of character, something that happens to other people, not to men who wear morning suits and hold degrees from Bristol University. To lose a son-in-law is a tragedy. To lose him to his own hand is a catastrophe that dismantles your entire understanding of the world. The days following the announcement were a blur of black mourning dress and shell-shocked faces. But it was the image of Princess Michael that was most haunting. The woman who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the haughty glare, who had looked down her nose at the world, was suddenly looking at nothing. The fire had gone out. In the photographs taken at the memorial service, she looked small. The fur coats and the pearls were still there, but they looked heavy now, like costumes from a play that had been canceled. This tragedy did something that no scandal had ever achieved. It stripped her of her narrative control. You can spin a racist comment, you can spin a rent scandal, you can argue with the press, but you cannot argue with a suicide. It is a full stop. It forced the world to look at the Kents not as cartoons, but as human beings standing in the wreckage of a profound mental health crisis. It revealed the terrifying fragility of the perfect life Marie Christine had chased for so long. She had spent her life trying to build a fortress of status to keep out the chaos of her childhood, to prove she wasn't just a refugee from a defeated country. She had finally built it. She had the palace, the title, the beautiful daughter, the handsome son-in-law. And then, with one pull of a trigger in a Gloucestershire barn, the fortress collapsed from the inside. The tragedy of Thomas Kingston recontextualized everything about Princess Michael's ambition. All the pushing, all the desperate grasping for precedence, all the anxiety about being royal enough. What did it matter now? It hadn't saved her daughter from widowhood at 42. It hadn't saved her family from the kind of visceral, bloody trauma that leaves scars on the soul forever. The Princess Pushy label suddenly felt irrelevant, a petty nickname for a woman who was now facing a pain that no amount of snobbery could anesthetize. As the funeral approached, the royal family, often criticized for their coldness, rallied around the Kents. But for Marie-Christine standing at the graveside, the irony must have been suffocating. She had spent her life wanting to be the center of attention, wanting the world to look at her. Now the world was looking, but they weren't seeing a grand princess. They were seeing a mother whose heart was breaking for her child, a woman realizing that the higher you climb the social ladder, the further you have to fall, and the harder the ground is when you finally hit it. The echoes of that tragedy in the Cotswolds did more than just end a life. They signaled the final curtain call for the performative world Princess Michael had inhabited. As the shock subsided and the ancient, creaking machinery of royal protocol kicked into gear for the final farewell, Marie-Christine was forced to walk a path she had spent her entire life running from. A public procession not of triumph or precedence, but of absolute unspinnable defeat. It was here, at the very end, that the true weight of her journey would finally be measured. The funeral of Thomas Kingston, held in March 2024, at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, was a masterclass in the very specific suffocating discretion that defines the British upper class in moments of crisis. It was a private service, stripping away the global pageantry that usually accompanies Windsor events. There were no television cameras, no cheering crowds, no commemorative broadcasts. There was only a small procession of black cars, the somber faces of the royal cousins, including Prince William, who stood alone without the Princess of Wales, and the devastating sight of the coffin. For Princess Michael of Kent, stepping out of the car into the grey London light, this moment marked the final irrevocable collapse of the world she had spent 5 decades constructing. The Chapel Royal is a place of history. It is where Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, a place of beginnings. But for Marie-Christine, it was the site of a brutal ending. As she watched the coffin of her son-in-law, the man who was supposed to be the future of her branch of the family, the man who represented security, stability, and success, being carried inside, the cruel futility of her life's ambition must have been laid bare. She had spent a lifetime worrying about precedence, about who bowed to whom, about whether she was being treated with the correct degree of reverence. And here, in the face of a wooden box and a grieving daughter, those concerns evaporated into the mist. Death, she was learning, is the only true egalitarian. It does not check the Gotha almanac before it strikes. It does not care if your father was a baron or if you live in a palace. It simply takes. In the months that have followed the tragedy, a profound silence has descended upon apartment 10 at Kensington Palace. The frenetic energy that once defined Princess Michael, the energy that drove her to write books, to give interviews, to feud with the press, to push, has been extinguished. The reports emerging from the palace are no longer about her imperious demands or her controversial brooches. Instead, they paint a picture of a woman who has become a ghost in her own home. She is reportedly frail, her mobility limited, her days spent in the quiet company of her husband, Prince Michael, who has remained by her side with a stoic loyalty that belies the decades of headlines. The Princess Pushy narrative has run out of road. There is nothing left to push against. The enemies she fought, the commoners, the modernizers, the press, have all moved on, leaving her stranded on an island of grief. The irony is Shakespearean. She spent her life demanding to be seen, desperate to ensure she was not ignored. Now, in her moment of greatest human suffering, the world has finally looked away, not out of malice, but out of an awkward, respectful pity. We do not know what to do with a villain who becomes a victim. It ruins the script. This final chapter forces us to reevaluate the entire arc of her life, not as a comedy of manners, but as a tragedy of displacement. If we strip away the titles, the jewels, and the scandals, what remains of Marie Christine von Reibnitz? We see a woman who was running. From the moment she left the dust of post-war Europe and the shame of her father's SS past, she was running toward a mirage of safety. Many observers have suggested that she came to see royal status as a kind of bunker against the chaos of her earlier life. She treated the British monarchy not as a job, but as a bunker. Her snobbery was the barbed wire she strung around the perimeter. Her haughtiness was the guard tower. She pushed people away before they could reject her. She insulted others to ensure she was the one doing the defining. It was a strategy born of deep, unresolved trauma. The trauma of the refugee who is terrified of being sent back to the camp. But the tragedy of the imposter syndrome is that you can never truly relax. You must perform the role until the curtain falls, and Marie Christine performed it with an exhaustion that we can only now appreciate. The constant hustling for money, the rent-a-Kent years, the humiliating bailouts from the Queen, these were the frantic attempts of a woman trying to keep the lights on in a theater that was slowly going bankrupt. She compromised her dignity to pay for the illusion of dignity. She sold her proximity to the crown to billionaires and oligarchs because she had trapped herself in a lifestyle that her bank balance could not support. It was a gilded cage of her own making, and the bars were made of debt and delusion. The racism scandals, particularly the colonies outburst and the blackamoor brooch, were the dark byproducts of this mindset. To maintain her sense of superiority in a world where she had no money and no real power, she had to believe in the inherent superiority of her blood. She had to believe that she was better than the African diners in New York, better than the mixed-race fiancé of Prince Harry, because if she wasn't better by virtue of birth, then what was she? She was just a broke woman living in a borrowed house. Her prejudice was the crutch that held up her fragile self-esteem. Now, looking at the wreckage of 2024, we see the ultimate failure of that strategy. The royal status she worshipped offered no immunity against the darkness of mental health struggles. It did not protect Thomas Kingston. In fact, one could argue that the unique pressures of the Royal Goldfish Bowl, the demand for perfection, the suppression of emotion, the relentless public scrutiny, contributed to the environment in which such a tragedy could occur. The fortress she built didn't keep the danger out. It locked the danger in. Lady Gabriella, the innocent bystander in her mother's opera, is now a widow at 43, left to navigate a grief that is compounded by the public nature of her existence. Marie Christine must now look at her daughter and realize that the legacy she fought so hard to secure, the title, the connection, the prestige, is cold comfort in the face of such loss. You cannot hug a coat of arms. A lineage cannot wipe away tears. History will likely not be kind to Princess Michael of Kent. She will be remembered in the footnotes of the Elizabethan era as a figure of controversy, a caricature of the wicked princess who provided color and conflict in the tabloids. Future historians will cite her as an example of the old world's resistance to the new, a symbol of the casual racism and elitism that the modern monarchy had to shed to survive. They will write about the brooch, they will write about the Princess Pushy nickname, but if they are diligent, they should also write about the fear. They should write about the girl from the shattered nobility of Germany who tried to reconstruct a fallen empire in a Kensington apartment. They should write about the mother who, in the end, stood by a grave, stripped of all her pretensions, reduced to the universal heartbreaking common denominator of human suffering. As the sun sets over Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns where she once walked with such purpose, Princess Michael of Kent sits in the fading light of her own era. The bustling, noisy world of the 21st century rushes past the palace gates, a multicultural, digital, chaotic world that she never understood and that never understood her. Inside, the rooms are quiet. The Grand Dame has finally put down her script. She has stopped pushing. And in this final, terrible silence, we are left with the realization that the most exclusive club in the world, the British royal family, is ultimately just a collection of fragile human beings hiding behind velvet curtains, waiting for the one visitor that no security detail can ever turn away. The story of Princess Michael is not a fairy tale, it is a ghost story. It is the story of a woman who spent her life haunting the corridors of power, only to find that in the end, she was the one being haunted. And the moral of her story is as old as the Greek tragedy she so resembled. You can conquer the social ladder, you can marry the prince, and you can wear the crown, but you cannot outrun yourself.